Brackets are a new but somewhat helpful way to guide deck building. Intended to help lead the Rule Zero conversation, these provide an outline for what a deck should look like at each level. On October 21st, 2025, the Commander format panel updated these brackets to adjust their philosophy and more clearly define each bracket. Before we get into this video, I want to preface by saying I am in no way a deck building expert or an expert on the bracket system. I'm simply offering my perspective and advice based on what I've learned while constructing around 200 decks over the past 2 years. Based on a poll asked on our channel, the majority of you wanted to see videos centered around deck building tips and Tyler and I's philosophy on EDH decks. This video will act as sort of a prelude to upcoming videos in the series, so make sure you watch till the end to get an idea of what is to come. Okay, let's get into it. Here they are. The updated brackets with the new philosophy of the Commander format panel woven in, along with updated expectations of what should happen each game in each bracket level. I could probably spend an hour talking about what I think each of the characteristics of each bracket level means, but that wouldn't really be helpful to anyone. I think the best way for me to help you understand the brackets and deck building implications that go along with them is breaking down each bracket, providing some examples with my own decks and commanders, and then providing takeaways to guide you while building. As a side note, for the vast majority of situations, if you aren't building your own decks, you can basically ignore the brackets. If all you do is buy a pre-constructed deck or a pre-con, you will slot into bracket 2 pretty well most of the time. I know they discuss wanting to move away from bracket 2 being tied to pre-constructed decks for multiple reasons, but in general, if you buy a pre-con, you should be able to slot into bracket 2. Hopefully, after these examples, you'll feel confident in your direction the next time you open up Moxfield to build your deck. So let's get into it. Starting with bracket 1. I was initially inclined to believe that in bracket 1 there's no real deck building process. However, the more I thought about it, the more I believe that there actually is a pretty deep process that requires some level of thinking to construct a bracket 1 deck. However, this is typically done in a way that is opposite to the typical deck construction in the brackets above. This is because you are building with no real end in mind besides achieving a theme, and this is important to keep in mind because if your deck has too much synergy, it will probably bump up into bracket 2. I personally have no real bracket 1 decks because it's not something I enjoy, but a good example of this deck is one from my local Magic Club where someone built a deck that has cards that only have chairs in their background art. You can imagine how this deck probably did not function very well, but it brought this particular player joy, and I think that's the real goal of bracket 1. So the takeaways for building a bracket 1 deck is it doesn't need to make sense to everyone, it just needs to make sense to you. As long as you enjoy it and aren't actively harming the play experience of other people in bracket 1, then it's a bracket 1 deck. So with that being said, let's move on to bracket 2. Bracket 2 is probably one of my favorite brackets because it feels specific enough to know when a deck falls into it, especially with the updated versions not being tied to pre-constructed decks. A great example of a bracket 2 deck is my SIG River Cutthroat deck. First of all, this deck was built on a budget. While not all bracket 2 decks will be built on a budget, there is some correlation here because of the typical lower quality of card choices and more of a lean into synergy rather than staples. This is clearly shown by the new transition arrows on the updated commander brackets. Again, budget won't always correlate with brackets, but it may have a factor when considering cards that aren't staples. To further this example, my bracket 2 SIG deck has no clear win condition you can point out in the deck list. This is because building around SIG requires you to play a lot of cards that will end up causing your opponents to lose 3 or more life. With life being a natural resource of Magic the Gathering, this deck can typically close out games in a telegraphed way by accumulating a board state of these cards. Another, and slightly more powerful bracket 2 deck I have is my Gut and Inspiring Leader deck. This is a Boros token aggro deck that focuses on putting creature tokens onto the board and running anthem effects to increase their lethality. This deck slots perfectly into bracket 2 for multiple reasons, but the main one has to do with the style of cards I chose. No one card stands out in particular, as the majority of cards either generate tokens or buff those tokens. This also ties into the fact that there are no game changers in the list. The win conditions align with bracket 2, by accumulating a critical mass of tokens and anthems to eventually win the game. I really love this deck, by the way, so let me know if you guys want a more in-depth deck tech, as it's more of a budget deck compared to the previous ones we've featured. Speaking of win conditions, when building decks in Bracket 2, I would personally recommend avoiding cards like Craterhoof Behemoth, Moonshaker Cavalry, and Grey Merchant of Asphodel, to name a few, for the following reasons. They're hard to disrupt. With ETB effects, they will need to be countered the second they're cast, and that's about the only way you can interact with them. Each of these win cons provide some sort of evasion, or don't win in ways that are obvious with what's on the board. Having a ton of blockers held up doesn't protect you from any of these. And because they are hard to disrupt and not obvious on the board state, and they win when played out of your hand, I would save these for Bracket 3. So what are the takeaways for building in Bracket 2? Find commanders which have lots of synergy to build around without being generically powerful. Obviously, you can build whoever you want and however you want, but this will reduce being seen as an immediate threat. And this also opens the door for more options in Takeaway 2, which is use cards you know are worse that possibly offer synergy. In a deck that cares about small creatures, play a Welcoming Vampire instead of a Trouble in Pairs. It may draw you less cards on average, but it increases the synergy of the deck, which is a heavy focus in Bracket 2. And 3. Find win conditions that don't feel like a shock when played. Oftentimes, a Craterhoof coming down closes out the game if it isn't countered. Building up a board state of anthems and tokens while running some protection to push into the late game for a win is much more suited for this bracket and will create a more positive play experience. Now onto the big one, Bracket 3. Bracket 3 is where the vast majority of decks fall in my opinion. I currently think it's a bit too broad of a category, but I'll still offer some helpful tips for building into this bracket. Threats will present themselves early. You'll want to find ways to run more removal than before. And this should be cheap, or flexible, or both, to keep up with cards being played in this bracket. Largely, these are considered staples. Do you have a way to deal with a One Ring? Or what if your win gets stopped when someone casts Teferi's Protection? Do you have backup ways to win? These are all things you should be thinking about in this bracket. The best way to move from a Bracket 2 to a Bracket 3 is to increase the card quality with staples. Take Dispatch versus Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshare as an example. Unless you are 100% certain you'll have 3 artifacts by around turn 3, the small downside of Swords and Path is worth it to ensure that these cards are always on. Sure, there may be some tap synergy, and tapping an opponent's creature down can stop it from attacking for one turn, but what about a value engine like Beast Whisperer? That is something you won't want to let accrue value for very long. And 4 mana is really easy to achieve by turn 2 or 3 with rocks and rampant growth effects. When taking a Bracket 2 deck to the level of a Bracket 3 deck, I would recommend doing a big overhaul on your draw, ramp, protection, and removal packages to ensure that they are fast and efficient and flexible enough to help against any deck you may see. With that being said, synergy is still an important focus. Most of you already know my Sam deck pretty well, but this deck has a heavy focus on synergy, which is surrounded by powerful cards that enable this game plan, while also running cards like Teferi's Protection, the One Ring, and Aura Shards that push it up into a high Bracket 3. So what are the key takeaways for building into Bracket 3? Well, first, ensure any interaction, draw, or other category of your deck is optimized and flexible. You want efficiency or flexibility in each of these spells to keep up with the faster pace of this bracket. 2. Choose win conditions that still only win because of value you have accrued this game, but that are harder to disrupt, like a combo or Craterhoof. And lastly, 3. While this bracket may feel higher power, synergy is still a focus. Don't lose sight of the fun things your deck wants to do, like make a bunch of food tokens or assemble a party. Now for the penultimate bracket. Bracket 4 is a high power bracket that in my opinion is best described as CEDH but with pet cards. And the main difference here is that there is no metagame that you build around. Taking a Bracket 3 deck to this level often looks like including plenty of fast mana and more game changers. You should consider giving up on some synergy for generically powerful cards. Using a mana drain instead of counterspell, playing Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Studies to try and race ahead of your opponent are the norm for this bracket. This means that it's even more important to have the best interaction possible. Running free counterspells and low cost or free spot removal is key to your success. While this bracket is often defined by game changers and powerful commanders, it doesn't have to be. Of course, my bracket 4 deck has no game changers or traditional fast mana. Seaton, Crowsand Protector, is one of the most underrated commanders in my opinion, and for the price of running just under 50 druids, he can give you huge returns. Even without game changers or fast mana, this deck often combos off for a win on turn 4 or 5, slotting it very easily into bracket 4. So here are some key takeaways. Be prepared to either win on turn 4 or stop a win on turn 4. That board wipe that you are holding in your hand may not be helpful if you've lost before you even have enough mana to cast it. 2. Ditch some of the lower quality synergy for generically powerful cards. It's time to leave behind the Welcoming Vampires and Tokashia's Welcomes for the One Rings, Rhystic Studies, and many more. While this isn't something you personally have to do, be prepared to see it in almost every other bracket 4 deck. Lastly, don't build around the metagame. There is a very thin line that separates EDH from bracket 4. Now on to what is in my opinion the closest to a perfect bracket. Bracket 5. I say this bracket is perfect because it perfectly describes the kind of decks you can find here. EDH is a format driven by meta and the best cards ever printed in Magic. My best advice for building a deck in this bracket is to scroll on EDH Top 16 or learn EDH and find a commander that appeals to you, and then figure out how it wins. The links to the mentioned websites will be down below. Then, grab a few of the top decks that have placed high and give it a go. Net decking is one of the easier ways to get into EDH, and as you grow as a EDH player, you can begin to make your own swaps and improvements based on playstyle and local meta. I personally have a Sisay Weatherlight Captain EDH deck, and I love it. The amount of salt in this bracket is very low because everyone is there to do one thing: win at all costs. Also, most EDH tournaments are proxy friendly, as many cards cost over $200, and it would be insane to get into this format without proxies. So please don't buy your EDH decks right out of the gate. I won't say too much more about this because I'm not an expert. The main takeaways involve building to the meta, learning lines, and focusing on higher card quality and winning. Go watch some Play to Win or any of the other amazing EDH channels to learn more. And please give EDH a try. It's an amazing way to play Magic. Now that we've gone over every bracket, my absolute best suggestion when trying to decide where to place your deck within these brackets is to playtest. Moxfield has a playtest feature, many other deck building sites do as well, or you can even just proxy it up and goldfish it at home. If you're happy with the game you've played or present a win by turn 8 or 9 without anyone interacting, then it's probably a 2. Same goes for 3. If you've got your win condition or combo by turn 6 or 7 while goldfishing, then the deck is probably a bracket 3. Is your deck presenting a win on turn 4 or 5 pretty consistently? Then the deck is a bracket 4. The nice thing about bracket 5 is you don't ever accidentally make a EDH deck. It is an intentional process using data from sites and the current and ever-shifting metagame. What was good 2 months ago may not be good anymore. Overall, use the brackets as a guide, not a hard set of rules. There will always be exceptions. Violating one category doesn't instantly disqualify a deck from a specific bracket. If you set out with the intention of having a bracket 2 deck, but find it wins consistently on turn 6 or 7, maybe try it in bracket 3, and maybe it will have a more positive play experience there. Nothing is set in stone, and these are not hard and fast rules. Build what you want to build, just ensure that you aren't deceiving other players. It's important to have a plan to win commander games, but that isn't where the fun should come from. It's a social format. Let's enjoy getting together and playing Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching till the end. I know that this may have felt like just a quick overview, but in our next video, we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of deck building, putting brackets aside and talking more about our philosophy and approach each time we open up Moxfield. If you enjoyed this video, be on the lookout for more to come. If you have any more questions or suggestions, leave it in the comments below. Liking and subscribing if you're new is the best way to help us grow and reach more people. If you haven't yet, go check out our past videos like this one where we suggest alternate commanders to the EDH Rec Top 100. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.